Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Paideia. Good morning, Sheena. Morning, Greshen. Morning, Carrie.
Good morning.
For those of you who don't know Greshen and Carrie yet, they are with ADR Network SA. Sheena, do you want to do a quick introduction of Carrie and Greshen?
Okay, so let me start with Carrie. We'll go in alphabetical order. Carrie has been a loyal member of ADR Network, and she's been by my side for the last more than a decade. We've traveled far and wide, providing training to international judges, to academics, to lawyers, to teachers, to ordinary people, businessmen, moms and dads, all kinds of things. So we've had to school children. We've had wonderful, wonderful experiences together. We've had amazing road trips. Remember channeling all our 80s music, Carrie? We've had some road trips. But Carrie has a degree in education with a specialization in inclusive education, and she's a registered TRE or trauma release exercise practitioner with a special interest in how humans behave in and heal from trauma. She's also busy doing a neurofeedback course with me. That's very exciting, and we'll unpack that with some of the others in that at some stage. Before we get to Carrie introducing more of herself and her work, I'll introduce Greshen, because he might be too shy and humble to do so. Greshen, are you going to put your camera on so we can see your face? This is Greshen. At the moment, with that little man, he looks like a saint, which he pretty much is. Greshen has been a really loyal friend of ADR Network SA and Access to Justice also for more than a decade. He has given up his time pro bono to assist in a large amount of access to justice matters where we use restorative justice and mediation techniques to interrupt patterns of injustice, particularly in Shaktuela eviction matters, and also in the taxi industry in the Western Cape, where, as we've spoken about before, we see the presenting injury or the presenting symptom, which might be labeled the violence of the taxi industry, but we never get to see or understand the systems that have people living against and living with their backs against the wall and working in situations where arbitrary action is meted out against them, and often along racial lines. And so we confront those systems and say, this is what leads to an inevitability of violence. We never say this violence is justified. We say that if you keep people in a humiliated space long enough, or if you treat them or subject them to unjust treatment long enough, if they have their backs against the wall long enough where they can't provide for their family, they can't move this way, they can't move that way, they're not consulted in matters that affect them, then there's an inevitability of violence. And any of us in those situations, I'm convinced, would become violent in whatever ways. Greshen can add to that when you get to him. But Greshen has also helped me a great deal with anti-racism work that we do in schools. So we did work in the hairstyle protests, both at Pretoria Girls High and Sansuki a number of years ago. Now, a lot of that work is coming back to us in a more manifest way, where we're starting to see, but wait a minute, there's still, aside from the systemic institutional racism that still exists, there's still individual racism that's manifesting in very overt ways in our schools today, last week, last month. It's not a thing of the past. And Greshen is very passionate, along with me, about interrupting those systems and having deeply honest and truthful conversations about these things, tough conversations. So yeah, over to you, Dan, and you can interrogate them further about their passions and their abilities and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes. So, Carrie, you take part in the 5-day training and assisting Sheena and Greshen with training new mediators. How do you think your education, especially in trauma release exercises and trauma healing, assist you as a mediator trainer, and would also assist mediators in helping to further their own skills?
Okay, well, Daniel, first of all, I'd like to address and unpack what is trauma. So we often say that an event is traumatic or stressful, and so specifically trauma is any event that overwhelms the person's ability to cope. And in mediation, we often see that people's ability to cope is being threatened or challenged. Trauma and stress exist on a continuum. So it can be that a number of events which are considered everyday stresses or small t traumas, in accumulation, they add up to the exact same effect as a large traumatic event would have. So say, for example, you lose your car keys and then you have a fight with your boyfriend, and then thereafter somebody on the street racially insults you. All those things have an impact. So there are important links for me also with racism and trauma or stress, because if you live under a racist system, then you are constantly faced with a barrage of these smaller traumatic or stressful events that do build up, and you are living within that atmosphere of stress. So there's also innocent trauma. So trauma which you are not necessarily a direct part of, but that you are a witness to. So say, for example, you are a child caught up in a divorce situation, which is very stressful, then you will experience that as traumatic as if you were directly involved in the actual argument or the relationship dynamics yourself, even though that actually is, you have no fault in that incident. Another aspect of trauma is developmental trauma, where trauma due to for instance, your birth circumstances, like fetal alcohol syndrome, would actually affect your development to such a state that you would be almost frozen within that stage of developmental trauma, and then you cannot progress or unlock that until perhaps later on in life, when you do the work or the deep paideia or the learning, and then you can progress. So I think all these things are interesting and necessary for our mediators to learn about, because they will constantly be faced with situations where they come into contact with people who experience trauma.
Yes.
just one last thing and then I'll finish.
Can I add something on that point? It's very important for mediators to understand that as we're dealing with conflict, we're largely dealing with traumatized individuals. And one of the things about traumatized individuals is they're often left in a hypervigilant state. So at the ready to fight, flight, freeze, or disengage, but at the ready. And this can often come across as abrasive, antagonistic. And so along with understanding trauma, it's very important for the mediator to be able to learn, and this is deep learning, deep learning, learn de-escalation techniques. And the main de-escalation technique that we find, and certainly I think the number one skill of a good mediator is the ability to listen, because allowing a party to ventilate and articulate what it is that's happened to them, how it is that they're feeling in a safe space, can help to de-escalate that. Now, I want to make a corollary to this, because we have just started engaging with neuropsychologists that specialize in neurofeedback, which we believe could add to our work in restorative justice and conflict resolution. And neurofeedback techniques might assist in dismantling trauma without long-term talk therapy, which can often reconsolidate the trauma, etc., etc. However, in a mediated space, I'm interested in the connection of the neurofeedback therapy, the trauma release exercise techniques that can help to dismantle the raw trauma and leave parties in a state where they can engage in a way that that very raw hypervigilance has been dismantled. So there's a lot of very interesting stuff coming together at the moment. And as I've said, Carrie and myself are in the process of learning what neurofeedback is, not to practice it, because we're not neuropsychologists, we're not neurologists, but just to understand how it may add to dismantling that raw trauma in the conflicts that we do deal with and in the parties' lives.
Yes, so what you're actually saying is that as a mediator, you would maybe able to recommend and suggest someone in those specific fields to assist, let's say, a very traumatized person to go for maybe a couple of sessions before you actually start your mediated process. And
or alongside, Dan,
yes,
you know, we're looking at, we're strongly in favor of integrative approaches which bring together professionals that can help in and around the process. And so as Carrie knows, very often there's a parallel counseling process, or there's a parallel therapeutic process of some type. And one of those therapeutic processes, by the way, is trauma release exercise, which Carrie practices. And it's something very simple that people can learn and integrate into their own lives. And when Carrie talks about innocent trauma, can I suggest, Carrie, and I don't know if I'm putting it in the right words here, that the mediator, as a bystander to or a witness to the traumatic situations. I'm sorry about my dog. That's my dog. She's a Pekingese. She's rolling around on her back. She's scratching herself. She's growling. Just in case anyone wants to know what's going on in the background of my house, that's my dog. But so mediators must assimilate some of the trauma that we are immersed in. We are immersed in. And so mediators, I recommend, must have from my point of view, a daily spiritual practice, whatever that might be, because it's very important for mediators to have a still mind. And we're going to unpack that on our mediation training program today, and we'll go deeper into that. But to create the still mind, we need to be able to have a still mind in all circumstances. It's not always possible, but we need to have a lifelong practice of at least cultivating that. And secondly, we need to have techniques that work out the trauma in the body. So isn't it Eckhart Tolle that talks about the pain body, how pain and trauma is actually contained within the body, and trauma release exercise, I think, is hands down one of the best techniques that I know of or have heard of that can release the trauma that is contained in the muscles via cortisol and adrenaline and whatever. And the neuropsychologists actually use trauma release exercise as one of the therapies that they use.
Yes, yes.
So I just wanted to link that to what Carrie was saying about the innocent trauma, and say, even as mediators, we are immersed in the trauma. It's not our trauma, but we are immersed in the trauma of others that must affect us, that must affect our health, that must affect our well-being, if we don't have practices and techniques that will help us to deal with it.
Yes.
Indeed.
And then over to you, Greshen, just for you as someone who's been with ADR Network for many years, what skills do you want mediators to foster? And even maybe if you want to talk a little bit about Paideia and deep learning, do you want to spend a moment on that?
Yes, thanks for that, Daniel. Good morning, everybody. And it's really a privilege and an honor to be here with Sheena, Yonka, and with Carrie and with Daniel. And I think we've been busy with this form of conflict mediation and resolution for most of my life, and we find that it's becoming more and more necessary now that the world seems to be moving towards a place of a lot more greater interpersonal chaos and interaction and conflict. And it seems like people are becoming divided over even more and more complexities like religion and politics and things that have been, the mainstays of division. And now things like racism has raised its head, but we're in the midst of a pandemic which has even brought divisions between people's own ideas of what the pandemic is all about. Some of people believe it's a conspiracy. Some people believe it's, between life and death. And,
It seems like we're losing your audio there, Greshen. But just to fill in there, I don't know if you want to maybe go out and come back in again. And Greshen, are you there? No, I think you need to go out and come back in again, but I'll pick up on one or two of the points that Greshen has raised, Dan. Yes. So he's talking about these polarizations and these binaries, which, by the way, have always been there, but they're being made manifest, aren't they? They're yes. being revealed. They're having a light shone on them out in the open. And now we're talking about them. We live in a world where people have got a camera now. So the stuff that wouldn't make, and everyone's a curator of their own social media. So stuff that we wouldn't normally have gotten to see is being made manifest, isn't it? And I don't know if you listened to the last Carolyn Mace talk that I sent you, but I know that it would resound with you. But she talks about how there's this kind of the polarizations are being made manifest, and they're going to be broken down so that we're in a space where there can be a coming together, there can be a healing, there can be an integration of everything. And that's why it's very important for us to have these mediated conversations where we see people shifting further and further into the othering, where we see people saying the evil is over there. We can say, wait a minute, let's talk about how we are evil in this world in our own right, how we are cruel in this world in our own right, how we give ourselves permission to be cruel. Now let's talk about the horse racing protests of last week. So we saw the media, remember there were these horse racing protests at Fairview, and we saw it reported initially that a horse was hacked to death with a panga, and that horses were chased and assaulted and that kind of thing. And then other reports started emerging that the horses were released, and in the chaos of being released, they were injured. We don't know, we weren't there, we don't know which report is true and which is not. But in the beginning, what we can say was there was unbalanced reporting in that the owner of the farm was interviewed to the exclusion of the protesters. When the protesters start being interviewed, you start seeing a different story emerge. Now, there's a balance. We can't possibly say until we know for sure what actually happens. But what we can say is if you are going to interview an employer in those circumstances, you're going to get one side of the story. We know that. So then we see this kind of angry rise out of people, and it starts providing cover for racists to say what they want to say about how these people are savage and barbaric and that kind of thing. Now it looks like the other side of the story is that there was a groom that was grooming a horse's hair or mane, and that in that grooming the horse reared up, which I can imagine to be a scary thing. And this horse was cut in the process of this horse rearing up. Now, the interesting thing is that the employer wanted to fire the person on the spot, and the other grooms, I believe there are 120 of them or so, said, no, please, he made a mistake. We will foot the bill collectively of the vet's fees. And this employer just said, no, absolutely not. And they staged a stay away. They were dismissed in that, and they were dismissed in a way that they couldn't access the UIF funds. If the reports I've seen are true, and that took place in January or February, we're now at September. It's been 7 months of people living in desperate circumstances, no UIF, no ability to access the UIF. 120 people would represent how many people that they have to feed? Maybe 4 times that on average.
On average, yes.
So then at the beginning of last week, they staged a protest because there's no other way of getting justice for themselves. And in that protest, some of the horses are injured. We don't have conclusive evidence on exactly how that took place. Let's extrapolate it and say that worst case scenario, pangas were used and a horse was hacked to death. We put this stuff onto other people and we say, don't be cruel. Yet innocent beings that are as intuitive, intelligent, and sensitive, pigs, cows, and sheep, land upon our dinner plates every day, having been stabbed in the throat, electrocuted, raped for their milk, their babies removed from them under traumatic circumstances, confined. So what voice do we have? What voice do we have even in the worst case scenario? Even in the worst case scenario that a horse was hacked to death, which I don't think is the case at all.
Yes.
But that was a provoked situation. Those innocent beings land up on our dinner plates every day entirely unprovoked. Entirely unprovoked. And we do this to billions and billions of animals every day. And what I'm saying, and what I hope that Paideia, our deep learning conversations will say, how am I giving myself permission to be cruel in this world? How am I withholding a wage from a desperate person? How am I paying someone to do my killing for me, to do my torturing for me, and then sitting from my armchair and say, don't be cruel, those people must be strung up and hung out to dry?
Yes.
How am I being a hypocrite in this world? Okay. So this is where we want to go with this, isn't it, Dan? That we have deeply uncomfortable conversations, just maybe asking questions about the other side. We don't know, we weren't there, but let's just ask the questions, and let's ask the questions why only the one side of things are being reported, like corruption. Stateside corruption is being reported. We know that 90% of summonses are issued in the state capture inquiry against white-owned companies. Why isn't that being ventilated? Why isn't the story of the corruptor being ventilated, or at least questions asked about? So, and we, part of what we do is education, and the Latin word for that is to lead us out of ignorance. Ignorance is what we don't know. So let's ask questions so that we start to know what we don't know. Not in a conspiracy theory kind of way, in a let's hear the story from an actual person kind of way. Let's provide a platform for the story of the actual person.
Yes,
Seems like we completely lost Greshen.
Yeah, we've lost Greshen, unfortunately.
People in an awkward silence.
Yes. No, that's so true. And Sheena, also what we mentioned the other day is the danger of a single story, and where does the story start and who tells the story. And Carrie, maybe you can also speak on this a bit, is the importance of mediators doing research, because...
Just before you move off the danger of a single story, remember she specifically says, if you tell someone's story, you have the ability to oppress them. And the biggest way that is being done is by starting with the secondly.
Yes.
So if you start with the arrows of the Native Americans rather than the arrival of the British, you're starting with the secondly. If you start with the failed African states instead of the settler colony, that's the secondly, okay? In the same way, if you start with a horse that was injured, that's the secondly, maybe the thirdly or the fourthly. What was the originating injury?
Exactly. Yes. So, Carrie, I know that you always assist a lot in research and assisting with cases regarding to research. But do you want to maybe speak a little bit about how to do, as a mediator, how to do research, and what are the things to look out for? What kind of probing questions that one would need to ask when handling a case?
Okay, so first of all, I think that in mediation, something that we need to be aware of is ethical decision making. So what we are doing, in a sense, is weighing values against each other and perhaps choosing which values to elevate according to our values as a mediator, which we intrinsically carry with us. So some values have intrinsic worth, such as love or truth or freedom, and other values, for example, truth or courage or responsibility, are actually traits or behaviors which can be a means to an end. Not so much truth, but courage or responsibility would definitely be behaviors which we would use to achieve a certain end. And then sacred values are those that can be held as moral imperatives for those who believe in them. And we need to acknowledge too that values vary among individuals, across cultures, and also across time. So when we are doing our research and our preparedness, part of what we need to do as mediators is we need to look at and try and uncover those intrinsic values, and then in the mediation to uncover them, perhaps to expose them, to unpack them and discuss them. A very important way of doing so is by utilizing reflective communication as a mediator, and also by asking clarifying questions. So you need to be comfortable in that space of asking clarifying questions, and you can ask as many as you need to, and that is a way of really remaining in the space of the mediation. So remaining in the space of perhaps emotional content that you might be hearing, and really just remaining in that room for long enough to unpack and really just uncover what those underlying values may be.
Can I build on one or two things that Carrie has just said, just to consolidate them? So values is often the thing that unlocks a dispute, and if you really work properly, sincerely, with courage and forbearance and sometimes long suffering, you can uncover that the parties have the same high values. Most
Indeed.
human beings have the same high values. Now how you do your research, if you will, in mediation, is that you're providing a platform for each person to tell their story. Whether they do it in the same space as each other is a product of how high the conflict is and how complex the conflict is, and what all the moving parts are. But you often in legal disputes, you're dealing with a presenting injury. In other words, an injury that you can see, whether it's a breach of agreement, a failed marriage, something gone wrong in a workplace. You're dealing with a presenting injury, something, the wound that you can see. Now it's your job as the mediator to try and put together a timeline of everything that's gone before, so that you can locate this wound or presenting injury within its proper and holistic context, and from there you can help the parties to start solving the problems. But your research is looking back to help the parties put the stories into a chronological order, because we often find there's an overwhelming previousness of other injuries that has led to this presenting injury, and one of the key factors one of the key instances that this happens is protest, and protest that turns violent. That's the presenting injury. That's the symptom. We need to delve into, we need to locate this presenting injury in its proper context, because that's real conflict resolution, isn't it? That's what led up to this, and how can we, because often previous injuries require acknowledgement of harm, apology, possibly reparations, before we can get to dealing with the presenting injury.
And also, I think you've previously mentioned as well, is that trauma victims sometimes don't actually have the language to express exactly what has happened to them. And as the mediator, you help them to unlock that. And like Carrie mentioned, is that you ask questions and give them that time to actually come to grip with what has happened to them, and to say, okay, you know, this is actually what happened in that moment, and this is what has led up to it, or, you know, so forth. So and
just
also
to give you an example of that, Dan, and this is a rather heinous example, but I think it illustrates the point. I often have women that come to me that desperately want to get divorced, but they can't articulate to me why. But they feel they need to get out of there, and I say to them, is there abuse? And they say no. Is there domestic violence? No. But then I start unpacking their stories with him, and does he swear at you? Oh yes. Is that not abuse? Yeah. Oh yeah, I suppose so. Does he threaten you in this way? Does he do this? Does he do that? And then very often I find that when I ask the question about the sexual relations, are you having sexual relations when you've said no? And often the woman will say to me, yes. And then I've helped them, and I'll say, do you know that's rape? So I've helped them give language to something that was happening to them, but in the midst of, you know, look, I don't want to go into the depths of it, but I think that there's a twisting of the religions. Christianity, certainly, which is the religion that I'm from, that I can see a twisted form of it being taught, where it seems that this kind of thing can be hidden in plain sight without people being able to give language to what's happening to them, because they feel like there's an obligation to submit no matter what. And it can be very complicated by economic withholding of economic provision and that kind of thing. And I'm not talking about in impoverished and uneducated circles. I'm talking about everywhere. I'm talking about educated, privileged society.
Sorry, Sheena, we lost you for a moment. Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, these, you know, helping parties to give language to something that is happening to them is a big part of what we do.
Yes, and also want to talk a little bit about the anti-racism dialogue that you are hosting at the moment, with regards to building that language. Is that we've lost Sheena completely? Sorry.
We have.
Yes. But what Sheena we've discovered and discussed previously is that some things are just so subtle that you don't actually know how to say it. It's just a glance that is just like, oof, you know, there's something weird about it, or the way someone elevates their voice, or the way they speak to you, or the way that the language that they use can be very traumatic and bring conflict about.
Indeed, yes. And those are subtle forms of racialism that are actually, first of all, institutionalized. And we must realize that racism is institutionalized and it is structural. So
yes, it's a
those
system.
are all things that are subtly imparted through the structure of racism. So,
just on that, I'm very, very sorry, but I had someone phone me twice in quick succession, so I just wanted to check if it was an emergency, and it wasn't really, but anyway. So we must understand that there are three aspects to racism. There's systemic racism, there's institutional racism, and there's individual racism. Now we tend to understand racism only at the individual level. So when someone calls someone a name, or they say they hate a person of this race or whatever, that's what we understand or interpret as racism. And our work in anti-racism, Dan, just with, I got the tail end of that conversation, but our work in anti-racism is to understand the historical context, the 400 years of exploitation and exclusion that has led to where we are, and to understand that those systems largely prevail, and we largely have an unjust society that has been in the making for 400 years. So unless we confront the systemic, which is our systems that keep people economically marginalized, the institutional, which is how this stuff plays out in spaces like schools, and coming off the back of being taught through a very Eurocentric, Christocentric lens. And so we've got to confront and dismantle those. We can't just think we can, stop people from saying this and expressing how they feel and that kind of thing. It's got to be a deep learning that takes place. Otherwise, we're never going to stop people from saying hateful things. They're just going to do it in a way that they're more careful about getting caught, which is not what we want. We don't want this stuff. It's the nice racists. It's the tea drinking genteel racists that take their housekeepers to a Zuma must fall protest because they're going to stand side by side with their housekeeper to protest Zuma. That's the sort of genteel, well-mannered racism that we should be deeply, deeply concerned about. I'm less concerned about someone that says hateful stuff because we can see who they are. We can see who they are and we can deal with them forthrightly. We know what we're dealing with. It's like a man with a gun. You can see what you're dealing with. It's the enemy that you might be sleeping next to. Do you know what I'm saying? If I can use an analogy from domestic violence, that is the more insidious enemy. And so it's the discussions of I'd love to emigrate to Oz, but I could never leave my beauty. Do you know those discussions? Have you heard those discussions?
Many a times.
Indeed.
Exactly. It's those discussions. It's that racism. That's the systemic stuff. That's the racism that wants reconciliation of the minority to the majority, expecting that the majority must resign themselves to waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and on foot coming to serve us. and literally wipe our babies' butts for us. And then we can still say, oh, no, those are the people that must be profiled and searched in our estates, etc., etc. That's the racism. That's the racism that we must confront, because that's a deeply systemic, immovable, unchanging racism that keeps the majority at bay, yet coming in to serve the minority. And it's not a sustainable, durable situation that we should be standing back and saying, no, let's paint a rainbow over it and let's just be nice to each other. No.
Indeed.
That's the, you've put a dressing over the wound too soon, saying peace, peace, where there is no peace, to quote the words of the ancient prophet Jeremiah, isn't it?
Mm.
No. So yeah, the anti-racism work that we're doing is tough. We're going to have another 3-day anti-racism training. Dan, we must look for dates to set, and maybe you can talk about it on Pada. Maybe Dan, I know you're mediating this conversation, but why don't you and Carrie went through that 3-day anti-racism training.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us about some of your experiences, how tough it was, how raw it was? Are you okay to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, as for me, and this is because me myself, intrinsically, I always ask deep questions, and I've done it for many years, growing up as well, asking, looking at things from a distance and thinking to myself, but why is this a certain way, or like, why are we doing stuff a certain way? But growing up in an environment that celebrated racism, and again, I'm not hating on people who are like that, or these are the people that we should love regardless of the way that they act, and at the same time they don't know themselves that they are doing things in a certain way. But even through that, I experienced deep questions that I had to ask myself, why I'm behaving a certain way and towards other people, not in a violent or necessarily in a or that what I would perceive in a violent way, but I just had to, yes, there were a lot of things that I had to question myself again and go sit and think about, and I think it is there. And this is growing up in South Africa, is that yes, in 1994 apartheid ended, but it was portrayed as it ended, but it never actually ended. And it was even ingrained in my upbringing as well. There are certain elements of how to think, how to speak, how to talk, how to treat people. And it's going to be lifelong learning on how to combat those almost intrinsic values that you've been taught as a child. And I think there was a grave injustice, not just to what has done to other people, but what has been done to me as a child growing up in an environment that promotes these kind of conversations. So so I don't know, Carrie, you might have I have a different view on this topic, but yeah, over to you, Carrie.
No, indeed. Thank you, Daniel. And I'd just like to honor your honesty and your, that's the sort of deep self-examination that I think is really important.
It is.
For
all of us. So just to pick up on something that Daniel said just before it's lost, when you said that apartheid ended in 1994, it was legal apartheid that ended. De facto apartheid exists. Look around you. Look around you. I know you're in Belgium right now, Daniel, but you know, you come from Cape Town, one of the most ruthlessly unequal societies, I would say, in the world. And I think part of why you and Jonathan left is because you didn't want to live in that deeply unequal society where there's this beautiful palette for the super rich, and the marginalized are very close, but on the outskirts, aren't they? You're constantly aware that it's a violence. It's a violence on us, and it's kind of a violence on our souls. Now, just coming back to apartheid. Apartheid was codified. It was a codified legal system of exclusion for 50 years. But the de facto system of exclusion started centuries before that and endures today. It endures today, and we need to be very honest about that. And as we say on our programs, to the extent that we still participate in a system that advantages us over others, we are racist. This is why we have to be very honest and very courageous about saying we need to dismantle these systems. We need to dismantle these systems. It's important for us. It's important for our children. The question is, Dan, I know you have 3 children. You also, so you do have that. You know the love of a child.
Yes.
But for my daughter and Carrie's daughter, both 20, and my son who's 15, we want to look ahead and say that a just world is possible. We don't want our children to partake in a situation long term that advantages them over other human beings. We don't want that, because it's not in our children's best interests, and it's not in those other children's best interests. I don't know if I've pointed you to the interview of, and maybe you can make this one of the links, Dan.
Okay.
The interview where Trevor Noah interviews Jim Carrey, and at one point Jim Carrey says he's got the biggest family in the world because he's part of this universal family, and we all are, because what we do to one, we do to ourselves, and we do to the whole thing. Carolyn Mason, that's and put her last talk up as well. I'll send it to you. She talks about how our bodies are micro-earths. Our bodies are micro-earths. We've got the same makeup, 70-80% water, the rest atoms and energy, or whatever it is. But she talks about how at a micro level, what we do to one cell in our body, we do to the whole system. What I do to you, I do to myself, and I do to the whole thing, good and bad. So she talks a lot about, we're very conscious of our macro decisions, the decisions out there, the decisions that people see. We need to become conscious of our micro decisions, the small decisions that can add up, and it resounds as well with how Carrie talks about the micro traumas, the things that kind of go through insidiously, we don't see them. They're not big out there decisions. But Dan, I know I've taken up a lot of airspace here, and you might give me a strong talking to later, and I'm prepared to take it. But it was such a, there's so much for us to discuss, isn't there?
Yes, there's, and definitely what we'll do is we'll have more discussions further on, and we'll probably even have a separate episode just talking about anti-racism or systems of oppression, these kind of things. But yeah, sorry, Carrie, do you want to have one last minute to say something or add?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm using my minute wisely. So Antonio Gramsci, in his prison notebooks, said that history has left us in an infinity of traces. And really for me is the challenge to understand my history, my personal history within my structural history, in terms of other people's history, and really to try and transform, as Edward Said said in his book Orientalism, to transform from a unitary identity to an identity that includes the other. So I think that's
you know what? I love that, Carrie. I love that. And why don't we transform from unitary to unitive? And as someone that delves into words, let's go and have a look at that, because the unitary is the singular, the unitive is the collective, the all-embracing. My story is connected to your story and Daniel's story and everyone else's story. The macro earth is connected to all the micro earths, which are us.
Yes.
And yeah, I love that. Thank you very much.
But yeah, thank you, Carrie and Sheena, for joining us today. I think on that note, we'll say goodbye, and then until next week. Thanks, everybody.
We'll go and see our trainers now. I see
Yes.
trainees.
Yes.
So are you going to end so that this is separate to the training?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll end this. Okay. Cheers, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you for that, Daniel.
Cheers, guys.
Bye-bye.